So, picture this. It's the 1950s,
Okay, I'm with you.
and you pick up a newspaper pretty much anywhere in the Western world. You're going to see one very specific, very loud narrative dominating the headlines about Kenya.
Oh, absolutely. And it was a terrifying narrative for the public to read. The story was basically that this completely irrational, bloodthirsty cult of savages had just suddenly emerged from the forest.
Right, just out of nowhere.
Exactly. And the narrative claimed they were there to just slaughter these noble British civilizers. I mean, the global public was fed this relentless diet of sensationalism.
It was everywhere. They portrayed the Kenyan fight for independence as something just purely evil and, primitive.
Yeah, and for decades, that was the story. The history books, the documentaries, all the political rhetoric at the time, it all reinforced this one very specific idea.
But, and this is why we are here today, when you bypass that global narrative and actually look at the primary sources, a completely different reality emerges.
It really does. It's almost unrecognizable from the headlines.
You discover that these fighters, the ones being called primitive savages, were actually highly organized. They were deeply principled peasants who were meticulously dismantling an engineered system of oppression.
The contrast between that colonial narrative and the actual historical reality is just staggering. I mean, when you look closely at the mechanics of what actually happened on the ground, you're forced to reconcile that massive myth with reality.
And it's a pretty uncomfortable reality.
Right. Very uncomfortable. Because it shows you exactly how a colonial power operates and maintains its control over a population.
Which is exactly the mission of our deep dives today. We are exploring a truly fascinating text. It was published in 1970, and it's called Mau Mau from Within.
Subtitled Autobiography and Analysis of Kenya's Peasant Revolt.
Right. And it's co-authored by Donald L. Barnett, who is an American anthropologist, and Karari Njama.
And Njama was actually a former guerrilla leader in the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which is just an incredible perspective to have documented.
It's vital, because what we're going to do today is unpack the structural, the economic, and, honestly, the psychological pressure cooker that led to this revolt.
We aren't just looking at a simple timeline of events from the 1950s. We really want to examine the why and the how.
Exactly. Why were 1 million people pushed to the absolute brink? And how do colonial systems systematically manufacture the very rebellions that eventually destroy them?
It is such a critical piece of history for you to understand, primarily because Kenya became an independent nation on December 12, 1963, largely because of the struggle of the men and women we are about to discuss.
Right, this isn't just some historical footnote.
No, not at all. This is the foundational crucible of a modern nation. Yet the true history of how they achieved that independence was actively buried. It was heavily distorted.
So let's start right there, with that distortion of history. Before we can even get into the mechanics of the revolt itself, we really have to understand the environment in which this book was written.
Yeah, the preface and the foreword do a great job of setting that scene.
They really do.
Mm.
Reading those sections, the sheer effectiveness of the British propaganda machine just becomes so obvious. I mean, they successfully branded the entire movement as barbarism.
They weaponized the term Mau Mau. They used it to evoke every racist, dark continent cliche they could possibly muster, basically just to frighten the Western mind.
But what really stands out to me is how that propaganda didn't just work on the outside world. It worked internally.
Oh, that is perhaps the most tragic element highlighted in these sources. The propaganda was so pervasive and so structurally enforced that even many Africans in Kenya later felt a profound sense of diffidence.
Almost a sense of guilt about the revolt. Right?
Exactly, guilt.
Yeah.
You have to understand that this wasn't just a matter of reading biased newspaper articles. The colonial state actually utilized these quote-unquote rehabilitation camps.
Where captured fighters were detained.
Right.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, these weren't just standard prisoner of war camps, were they?
No, not at all. They functioned essentially as centers of psychological warfare. The source material explicitly states that concentrated, continuous, and consistent humiliation was a principal element in their process.
Wow. Consistent humiliation.
Yes. The objective was to systematically break down a person's psychological defenses. They wanted to instill the belief that their fight for freedom was not just illegal, but fundamentally savage and wrong.
That is so insidious. So you have this incredibly complex post-independence environment. The very people who fought and suffered in the forest emerge into a free nation, but their behavior is deliberately self-effacing.
Because the guilt and shame had been drilled into them so effectively, they actually hesitated to claim their rightful place as the heroes of their own liberation.
Think about the psychological weight of that. You endure years of unimaginable hardship to free your country, and the apparatus of the state works overtime to convince you that you are the villain of the story.
It's heartbreaking. And into this highly distorted historical landscape walks Donald L. Barnett.
Right, the American anthropologist.
Yeah. So he's a young researcher traveling to Kenya in the early 1960s. He surveys all the existing literature on the revolt and quickly realizes it's essentially a collection of, as he calls it, cowboy and Indian sagas.
Like the old Hollywood movie.
Exactly. You have writers like L.S.B. Leakey, or you have these memoirs written by British security forces, and they are all producing these wildly biased accounts.
They consistently paint the white settlers as these noble civilizers.
And the Africans as reverting to something ancient and primitive, essentially devolving into a state of irrational bloodlust.
So Barnett sees this and recognizes a massive void in the historical record.
A huge void. Virtually none of the existing authors had even attempted a serious structural analysis of the movement.
Right, there was no inquiry into its root causes, no look at its internal character or how it was actually organized.
Because the existing literature was entirely obsessed with painting a picture of something sinister and awesome rather than something political and economic.
So Barnett knows that to get the real truth, he has to bypass those official colonial records. He has to go directly to the primary sources.
He had to speak to the Africans who actually lived it.
Which brings us to a really compelling moment in the text. It's Barnett's first meeting with Karari Njama.
Yes, the visual contrast in this scene is just brilliant. It tells you so much about the transition these people had undergone.
So, set the scene for us. It's March 1962. Right?
Right. Barnett travels about 110 miles north of Nairobi. He's climbing up to an altitude of almost 7,000 feet.
That's high up.
Very high. He arrives at the small homestead and approaches a traditional dwelling. It's a structure made by weaving branches together and packing them with mud.
And the view from there is supposed to be incredible.
Oh, he's confronted by this spectacular sweeping view overlooking the 1,000-foot-deep Gura River Valley. It's stunning. And out from this hut walks Karari Njama.
And what does he look like?
Well, he's a teacher now, a father. He's dressed casually in khaki shorts and an open-collared sports shirt. He looks entirely perfectly ordinary.
Just a regular guy.
Exactly. Yet, a decade earlier, this very same man was a senior guerrilla leader. He survived in the dense, freezing environment of the Aberdare forest.
I mean, the contrast between the man greeting Barnett and the men from the forest is just profound.
It really is. And the sources actually include a photograph of Njama to highlight this. It was taken on June 6, 1955.
Which was the exact day after he was captured by colonial forces.
Yes. And in that image, he is wearing this tattered white jacket. His face is hardened, he's gaunt, and completely exhausted.
I can only imagine.
He looks like a man who has endured the absolute limits of human physical and psychological endurance. But then, 7 years later, he is welcoming an American researcher into his home to drink tea.
That meeting sparks this incredible 6-month collaboration. Barnett actually moves his entire family in with Njama to spend half a year meticulously recording his life history.
It's an amazing commitment to the research.
So let's dig into the methodology they used for this,
Yeah.
because it really challenges a lot of traditional Western academic assumptions about how history should be recorded.
It does. Barnett utilizes what he calls a multiple autobiography approach.
Which was necessary, right? Because the reality of the forest fighters was that they didn't exactly leave behind extensive written archives.
Exactly. Very few of the guerrillas had formal education beyond primary school. I mean, they were fighting a brutal war of survival in the freezing forest. They weren't sitting around keeping detailed bureaucratic ledgers.
Right. So Barnett gathered life histories from multiple participants, people like Priscilla Gathani, Mohammed Mathu, and of course Karari Njama.
And then he meticulously cross-checked their spoken accounts against one another.
Now, I know this approach often faces skepticism in Western historical circles, right? Because they traditionally prioritize written documentation above all else.
They do. However, Barnett leveraged something that scholars of African history understand very deeply. He tapped into the extraordinary capacity for recall within societies that rely on oral history.
And this is so important. If you were listening to this and you grew up in a culture saturated with written text and digital storage, the idea of relying entirely on memory might seem, well, fragile.
Sure, it sounds unreliable to a modern Western ear.
Right. But in a society without a widespread written script, the oral tradition isn't just like casual storytelling around a fire.
No, it functions as the structural hard drive of the culture.
I love that phrase, the structural hard drive. Important events, legal agreements, social histories, they are all stored in memory, and they are reinforced through song, proverb, and repeated social interaction.
Exactly. When individuals in this culture meet, they don't just exchange pleasantries about the weather, they engage in a very detailed recitation of significant happenings since their last encounter.
So Ninjama's ability to recall highly specific details from a decade prior wasn't some superhuman feat?
No, not at all. It was the natural, cultivated product of his socialization within Kikuyu culture.
But I think any listener would naturally wonder about the human element here. I mean, how do we know these individuals aren't just polishing their own legacies?
It's a fair question. Memory is fallible.
Right. And when you are recounting a war, there's just a natural human tendency to exaggerate your own heroism or, downplay your mistakes.
That is exactly why Barnett's cross-referencing method was not just helpful, it was structurally essential for this project. The key lies in the demographics and the social structure of the Kikuyu people.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, even though they numbered over 1 million people, they functioned essentially as a small-scale, highly interconnected society.
Over 1 million people, but still tight-knit.
Extremely tight-knit. They were freely mobile, constantly moving between the rural reserves, the European farms, and the city of Nairobi. But information traveled with unbelievable rapidity along these informal networks of dispersed kin.
So it functioned like an open communal ledger.
Precisely. If thousands of people are constantly moving through these spaces, the city, the forests, the detention camps, their paths are continuously crossing. Everyone knows someone who knows someone.
So you can't really lie without getting caught.
Exactly. If an informant made a chronological error, or omitted an uncomfortable truth, or fabricated some heroic action, someone else in the network would definitely know.
Does the book give any examples of that happening?
It does. Barnett documents an instance where one informant conveniently omitted the fact that he had actually served as a government informer while he was in a detention camp.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big omission.
Right. And Barnett discovered this omission almost immediately from a second informant, and then he went and verified it with 2 others.
So you really cannot easily manipulate your own history when your entire community serves as a living, breathing archive of shared experience.
Historical narratives are usually dictated by the victors, right?
Sure.
From their central offices with all their official stamps.
But here, Barnett and Ajama are extracting history from the marginalized, and they are using the marginalized community's own rigorous, peer-reviewed methods of verification.
It's a remarkable achievement in historical documentation.
It really is. And that structural verification gives us a very solid foundation to work from.
Yeah.
But if we want to understand what actually drove Karari Njama, who was an educated school teacher, and thousands of other ordinary people to just leave their homes and endure the freezing, brutal conditions of the Aberdare forests.
We really need to understand the world they were rejecting.
Exactly. We have to map out the societal structure of Kenya in the post-World War II era.
And the sources rely heavily on the 1948 census data to paint a picture of what can only be described as a legally engineered caste system.
A caste system. That's a strong term. But let's look at the numbers. The demographic numbers from 1948 are really the fundamental architecture of this entire conflict.
They absolutely are. The data breaks down the population into 3 distinct tiers. At the base, you have roughly 5.5 million Africans.
Okay, 5.5 million.
In the middle, you have about 120,000 Asians. And that category included Indians, Arabs, and Goans.
Right.
And then at the very top, you have only about 30,000 Europeans.
I really want to make sure those numbers sink in for you listening. 30,000 Europeans in a total population of over 5.6 million people. The Europeans made up less than 1% of the total population.
Less than 1%. It's staggering. Yet this tiny fraction of the population operated as a high caste aristocracy. They wielded absolute control over both the political and economic life of the entire colony.
Let's talk about the political side first. How extreme was that imbalance?
To illustrate it mathematically, look at the Kenya Legislative Council, which was the governing body. It had 11 elected European members.
Okay, 11 for the 30,000 Europeans.
Right. It had 5 elected Indian members, 1 elected Arab member, and only 4 African members.
Wait, 4 members for 5.5 million people?
Yes. But it gets worse. Those 4 African members were not elected by the 5.5 million people they supposedly represented.
Let me guess. They were appointed.
Appointed directly by the British governor.
So the demographic that makes up 97% of the human beings in the country has absolutely zero democratic voice.
Zero.
But as glaring as that political disenfranchisement is, the economic disparity is what truly reveals the mechanics of this system.
Yes, the wages are where you really see the system at work.
Let's break down those average wages from that same 1948 data. The average European worker earned $1,739 a year.
Okay.
The average Asian worker earned $741 a year.
Almost $1,000 less.
Right. And the average African worker, take a guess.
It's devastating, $73 a year.
$73. And wait, that wasn't just cash, was it?
No, it wasn't. That $73 actually included the estimated financial value of whatever meager food and housing allowances they were provided by their employers.
So the actual cash in hand was even less. That is just brutal.
And the spatial organization of the country perfectly mirrored this economic chasm.
What do you mean by spatial organization?
Yes.
Where people were allowed to live.
Exactly. You have roughly 9,000 European settlers, and they were granted exclusive legal rights to 16,700 square miles of the absolute best, most fertile agricultural land in the country.
That's the area famously known as the White Highlands.
Yes. Conversely, millions of Africans were geographically restricted. They were crowded into these native land units that were rapidly deteriorating from overuse and fragmentation.
Because there were just too many people forced into too small an area.
Right. And for those who couldn't survive in those rural reserves, the only option was urban poverty.
And the text vividly describes the reality for Africans drifting into Nairobi as landless peasants.
Because of the strict segregation laws, they were forced into specific slum locations, places like Pumwani or Kariokor.
And what were the conditions like there?
They would literally sleep 12 or 16 people to a single room, just to generate enough body heat to survive the cold Nairobi night.
16 people in one room, just to not freeze.
It was a desperate situation.
Now, in the middle of this massive polarized structure, you have the Asian population. They outnumber the European whites 4-1, but they are absolutely dwarfed by the African majority.
Right, they're sitting right in the middle of this powder keg.
The sources explain that they were mostly urban traders, merchants, and professionals. But notably, they were legally barred from owning agricultural land in the White Highlands.
The Europeans made very sure to protect their monopoly up there.
So structurally, the Asian population is caught in a classic middle management bind.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
They are being constantly squeezed from the top by the European elite, who refuse to grant them equal status. But they are simultaneously terrified of the massive African majority at the bottom rising up and taking over.
Yes, and colonial systems do not create these demographic middle tiers by accident. It is a highly calculated feature of colonial management.
So it was intentional.
Absolutely. The European administration utilized discriminatory policies to ensure the Asian community never accumulated enough political power to challenge white supremacy.
But they still needed them, right?
Oh, they absolutely relied on the Asian community to handle the daily, on-the-ground economic frictions with the African majority.
How did that play out in daily life?
Well, think about it. If an African peasant needed to buy basic goods, or a laborer was spending his meager wages, the person standing across the counter wasn't a British aristocrat.
Right, it was an Asian shopkeeper or a petty trader.
Exactly. So the Asian merchant became the visible face of the colonial economic system to the African population.
I see, so they took the brunt of the anger.
Consequently, the authors note this complex dynamic where Africans often directed more immediate, vocal bitterness toward the Asian community than the Europeans.
Because the Europeans were largely invisible.
Yes. They were isolated up in their vast, pristine agricultural estates in the highlands. They were completely removed from the daily struggle of the urban slums or the trading posts.
Wow. So the Asian community existed in this state of deep ambivalence. They strongly desired political and social equality with the Europeans.
But they feared that any move toward true African majority rule would completely obliterate their relatively privileged middle-tier status.
It was a hierarchy engineered specifically to redirect friction away from the white minority at the very top.
A masterclass in divide and rule.
So let's shift our focus to those vast agricultural estates you mentioned, because this is where the economic logic of the colony becomes incredibly ruthless.
The White Highlands.
Right. If you are one of those 9,000 European settlers and you have just been granted thousands of acres of pristine highland soil, you immediately face a massive logistical problem.
Which is labor. You possess the land, but you cannot possibly clear it, plant it, or harvest it all by yourself.
You need thousands of laborers to actually generate wealth from that land. But here's the catch. The African population already possesses their own land in the reserves.
And historically, they are entirely self-sufficient farmers and pastoralists.
Right. And if someone is self-sufficient, they have absolutely no incentive to come work on your farm for pennies a day.
Exactly. Why would they?
So the question becomes, how does a colonial power force a self-sustaining population to abandon their independence and become a massive pool of dirt-cheap wage labor?
You have to systematically dismantle their ability to sustain themselves.
And what makes this history so chilling is that this wasn't just some accidental byproduct of incompetence. It was a clearly articulated strategy.
It was literally put on the record. The sources point directly to a man named Lord Delamere. He was a prominent leader among the European settlers.
Ready to you.
In 1912, she testified before a labor commission, and he laid out the exact blueprint for this system. He explicitly argued that the land reserved for the native population had to be severely restricted.
And his logic was brutally straightforward, wasn't it?
It was. He basically said, if the Africans have enough land to breed their livestock and grow their own food, how can we possibly oblige them to provide labor for our estates?
He's literally saying the quiet part out loud. The strategy is intentional impoverishment.
Cut their land, force them to work.
So following that logic, the British colonial government begins alienating, which is a very polite legal term for confiscating vast tracts of the most fertile African land.
And to understand the sheer scale of this theft, you just have to look at the numbers from 1934.
Walk us through those.
Okay, so by 1934, just over 2,000 European settlers held more than 6.5 million acres of land.
Let me do the math on that. That averages out to over 2,500 acres for every single settler.
Over 2,500 acres each. But here is the detail that truly exposes the motive behind the policy. Of those 2,500-acre estates, the settlers were, on average, only actually cultivating about 274 acres.
Wait, they were only using 10% of it.
Roughly, yeah. Even as late as 1940, over 1 million acres of the White Highlands sat entirely unused.
So they didn't confiscate millions of acres because they actually needed it all for farming.
No, they confiscated it specifically to deny the Africans the space they needed to survive independently.
The psychological impact of that land alienation just cannot be overstated, particularly for the Kikuyu people.
Because the Kikuyu were the largest agricultural tribe in the region.
Right, and because their ancestral lands directly bordered the area designated as the White Highlands, they absorbed the absolute brunt of this displacement.
And you have to understand how the Kikuyu conceptualize land. It is not merely a tradable economic commodity to them.
It's not just real estate.
Not at all. It holds profound sacred and ancestral significance. It is the literal foundation of their identity and their continuity as a people.
I try to put myself in the shoes of a Kikuyu farmer during this era. You are forced off the land where your ancestors are buried.
You're pushed into a crowded, deteriorating reserve.
Right, where the soil is eroding because there are too many people and too many animals confined to way too small a space.
And then from that overcrowded reserve, you have to look across a literal boundary line and watch your own ancestral fields sit completely empty and unused.
Simply because a white settler holds a piece of paper claiming ownership.
Exactly. And the author makes a point to define alienation in this specific context. It wasn't just a legal transfer of ownership.
It was visceral.
It was the agonizing daily reality of seeing your life-sustaining land remain visibly in existence right in front of you, yet rendered violently unattainable.
The resentment that proximity breeds must have been unique and incredibly explosive.
It was the bedrock of the entire revolt.
But confiscating the land was really only step one of the blueprint, because if reducing their land wasn't enough to force every single man into the labor pool, the colonial administration had another tool. They weaponized the tax system.
Ah, yes, the hut and pole tax.
They introduced this measure, and here's how it functioned. It was a flat tax imposed on the African population. And crucially, it had to be paid in cash.
Cash that they didn't have.
Right, because the government simultaneously restricted Africans from growing highly profitable cash crops, such as Arabica coffee, in their own reserves.
So it was mathematically impossible to generate the required cash while staying at home.
Exactly. The only way to acquire the cash to pay the tax was to leave your family, travel to a European estate or into the city, and offer your labor.
And the wages they were paid for that labor were entirely manipulated.
This manipulation of wages reveals the full extent of the economic trap. Because you might naturally assume that if a settler needed more labor, they would raise wages to attract workers, right? Basic supply and demand.
But the colonial logic operated in reverse.
How so?
Well, a settler newspaper in 1913 explicitly debated this exact issue, and they concluded that raising wages would actually decrease the labor supply.
Because if an African worker earned a higher wage, they would hit their required tax quota much faster.
Exactly. And the moment they had the cash to pay the tax, they would just quit and go back to their families in the reserves.
So the settlers calculated that to maintain a permanent, year-round labor force, they had to keep wages suppressed to the exact threshold of mere survival.
They needed the African worker to be constantly chasing the tax payment, never able to accumulate any surplus wealth.
When you look at the mechanics of it, the system functions like a casino where the house has rigged every single variable.
They control the chips, they control the exits, and they control the clock.
But to enforce a system this oppressive across millions of people, you need a massive mechanism of surveillance and control, just to ensure no one slips through the cracks.
And that surveillance mechanism was formalized in 1920 with the introduction of the Kipande system.
The Kipande. What exactly was it?
The Kipande was a mandatory identification document. Every single African male over the age of 16 was fingerprinted, and they were legally required to carry this combined identification and employment card on their person at all times.
At all times.
Yes, typically worn in a small metal box around the neck. The Kipande was a tool to severely restrict movement and strictly enforce labor contracts.
Let's examine how this worked for the hundreds of thousands of people caught in the squatter system. Because the sources note that over 200,000 Kikuyu were living as squatters on European farms.
Right, and a squatter was an African who lived on a European's land. And in exchange for a nominal wage and perhaps a tiny patch of dirt to grow their own food, they were legally bound to provide 270 days of labor a year to the landowner.
270 days. That leaves barely any time for their own crops.
Almost none. And if a squatter wanted to leave the farm for any reason, whether to visit a sick relative in another district, travel to a town to buy supplies, or simply go pay their tax, they could not legally do so without their white employer physically signing their Kipande.
Wait, they needed a signature just to leave the property?
Yes. If an African man was caught by the police traveling without that signature, he faced immediate imprisonment.
Furthermore, the control extended way beyond just the men, didn't it?
It did. The laws governing squatters allowed the European landowner to conscript the squatters' wives and children to work on the farm at will.
Without a separate contract.
Without a separate contract, particularly during harvest seasons when they needed extra hands. It was a system that effectively bonded entire families to the land and the landowner.
Let's just call it what it is based on the mechanics. It was serfdom.
Functionally, yes, absolutely. And the cumulative impact of these three structural pillars, the massive land theft, the enforced tax system, and the Kipande surveillance, created something the authors refer to as a leveling effect within the Kikuyu society.
What does that mean? A leveling effect?
Well, before colonization, the Kikuyu had their own internal social stratification. There were wealthier individuals with large herds and poorer individuals. There were complex class dynamics.
Like any society.
Exactly. But the sheer weight of the colonial extraction machine compressed all of those internal differences. All 1.5 million Kikuyu were pushed down into the exact same socioeconomic basement.
They became a massive, uniformly impoverished peasant base.
Yes. All experiencing the same daily humiliations and all looking up at a single, clearly defined common enemy.
And this structural leveling is really the primary reason the Kikuyu naturally evolved to become the vanguard of the coming revolt.
It united them in a way nothing else could have.
Now, we have spent a lot of time on the economic suppression, which is only half of the colonial playbook.
Right. The other half is cultural suppression.
Exactly. As the African population realized the inescapable nature of this economic trap, they understood that the only viable path to advancement, the only way to actually navigate this new world, was to acquire Western education.
Education became the primary tool for survival.
However, the colonial state did not provide public schools for Africans. The gatekeepers to education were the European Christian missionaries.
And this dynamic sparked a profound cultural war.
It really did. It created an immediate and deep cleavage within the African population.
Because on one side, you had a rising demographic of educated individuals who were almost exclusively Christian. Because, you had to convert to attend the mission schools.
You couldn't get the education without the religion.
Right. And on the other side, you had the vast majority of illiterate peasants who maintained traditional practices and were labeled by the missionaries as pagan.
And this caused an internal rift. For many in that newly educated elite, the European colonizer became what sociologists call their reference group for success.
Yes, because the Europeans so obviously possessed superior technology, literacy, and military power, some educated Africans began to internalize that colonial narrative.
They started viewing their own traditional customs as inherently backward or inferior.
It's the psychological impact we were talking about earlier.
But the Kikuyus are an incredibly pragmatic people. They recognize the utility of Western education, but they were absolutely not willing to entirely erase their identity to get it.
And in the late 1920s, this simmering cultural tension reaches a major breaking point.
Missionaries decide to draw a hard line in the sand.
They issue these ultimatums to the Kikuyu communities. They state that if they want their children to attend the mission schools, the community must completely and publicly renounce their traditional practices.
And the two specific practices the missionaries targeted were polygamy and female circumcision.
Right. Now, to understand the gravity of this, you have to understand that for the Kikuyu, the circumcision ceremony was not merely a medical procedure.
It was much deeper than that.
It was the fundamental spiritual, educational, and social prerequisite for full tribal membership. It was the gateway to adulthood and marriage.
So the missionaries weren't just asking them to change a habit. They were functionally demanding that they cease being Kikuyu.
Precisely. And the Kikuyu response to this ultimatum is honestly one of the most fascinating examples of cultural resistance in the 20th century.
It's incredible. Faced with the choice between abandoning their culture or abandoning education, they chose a third path.
They decentralized the educational system.
They realized they didn't need the European missionaries to learn how to read or do mathematics. So in 1928 and 1929, they founded their own independent networks.
The Kikuyu Independent Schools Association, known as KISA.
And the Kikuyu Karinga Educational Association, with Karinga meaning pure.
Right. But this is where the ingenuity really shines. Because education and religion were so deeply intertwined in the colonial model, the Kikuyu didn't just build schools.
They established their own churches.
They formed the African Independent Pentecostal Church and the African Orthodox Church. And their approach to theology was just brilliant.
They took the very text the missionaries had introduced, the Bible, and they used it to construct an airtight theological argument against the missionaries themselves.
It is a classic example of cultural syncretism, blending new ideologies with existing frameworks. The independent church leaders pointed out a glaring inconsistency in the missionaries' demands.
Yeah, they read the Old Testament and pointed out that it is entirely populated by revered patriarchs who practice polygamy.
Abraham, David, Solomon.
Exactly. Furthermore, they noted that nowhere in the biblical text is female circumcision explicitly banned.
So they essentially analyzed the foundational document of Christianity and told the European missionaries, you are violating your own textual rules.
You are presenting your own arbitrary European cultural norms as the Word of God, and we reject that. It is a masterclass in using the oppressor's own intellectual framework to dismantle their authority.
It really is. And beyond the theological victory, the logistical achievement was immense. They had to fund, build, and staff all these institutions entirely without government support.
It was all community fundraising.
Entirely. And by 1952, these independent networks had expanded to include roughly 300 schools, serving nearly 50,000 pupils.
50,000 students outside the colonial system. That's massive.
And the impact went far beyond just literacy. These schools were incubating a new, independent national consciousness.
Because by decoupling the concept of modernity from European control, they created spaces where African history, politics, and grievances could be discussed freely.
Away from the surveillance of the colonial administration and the moral policing of the missionaries.
Now, while this intellectual independence was growing in the rural reserves, a parallel evolution was happening in the urban centers.
Specifically in Nairobi.
Right. The text places a strong emphasis on how the city of Nairobi acted as an intense cultural melting pot.
Because of the extreme land shortages we discussed earlier, men from tribes all across the colony were forced to migrate to Nairobi seeking wage labor.
You had the Kikuyu, the Luo, the Kamba, the Baluya.
And when they arrived, the colonial system didn't care about their specific ethnic heritage. It classified all of them uniformly as natives.
They were all subjected to the exact same Kipande laws, the same curfews, and they were all forced to live 12 to a room in the same freezing slums.
And that shared urban misery fundamentally altered the social dynamics of the colony.
How so? Because historically, they didn't interact much.
Historically, these different ethnic groups might have had limited interaction or even historical rivalries. Their social structures were vertical, focused inward on their own tribal hierarchies.
Right.
But the urban environment of Nairobi aggressively broke down that tribal isolation. It replaced it with a horizontal solidarity.
As these men worked side by side on the railways and the factories and lived together in the slums, they began to form trade unions and intertribal social clubs. They start to realize, I am not just being oppressed as a Kikuyu, and you are not just being oppressed as a Kamba.
We are being oppressed as Africans by a system designed to exploit all of us.
Exactly. When you analyze the macro structure of the colony at this point, you can clearly see the scaffolding of a revolution falling into place.
All of the pieces are there.
You have a massive, uniformly impoverished peasant base in the rural areas, nursing deep, sacred grievances over stolen land.
You have a rapidly expanding urban proletariat in Nairobi developing cross-tribal political solidarity through unionization.
And crucially, you have an independent intellectual infrastructure, the independent schools and churches churning out educated, politically aware leaders who owe absolutely nothing to the colonial state.
The environment is completely saturated with tension. It's ready to ignite.
Which brings us to the final, critical piece of the puzzle, political organization. We have established the economic starvation and the cultural rebellion. But how does a population transition from recognizing their oppression to organizing an armed guerrilla revolt in the forests of the Aberdares?
Because, contrary to the colonial propaganda, it was absolutely not a sudden, irrational explosion of violence.
The sources meticulously trace a 30-year lineage of African political organizations desperately trying to play by the rules, trying to engage the British system peacefully.
The history of African political organization in Kenya during this era is fundamentally a history of exhausted patience and systematically ignored petitions.
Let's trace that lineage. It goes back to 1920, right?
It does. With the formation of the Kikuyu Association, this early group was predominantly composed of older chiefs and headmen.
So they were more conservative.
Highly conservative. Their strategy was to politely petition the colonial government regarding the ongoing land theft and harsh labor policies.
But polite petitions from subjects to rulers rarely alter the balance of power.
They achieved absolutely nothing. Consequently, the younger, more frustrated generation realized a new approach was needed. And in 1921, the Young Kikuyu Association was formed.
And this group represents a totally different demographic. It is led by a man named Harry Thuku, who worked as a telephone operator.
The membership consists largely of lower-class clerks, domestic servants, and urban workers.
They are not interested in polite letters. They want to take bolder, more disruptive action against the Kipande system and the continuous tax hikes.
And this shift in strategy leads directly to the first major violent flashpoint in the history of the struggle.
The events of 1922.
Yes. Harry Thuku's organization, which had actually evolved into the East African Association to broaden its base beyond just the Kikuyu, decides to organize a massive act of civil disobedience.
What do they do?
They mobilize thousands of Africans to gather in Nairobi and simply drop their mandatory Kipande cards on the lawn of Government House.
Just a peaceful rejection of the surveillance state.
Exactly. Peaceful, albeit highly illegal under colonial law.
And the colonial government's response sets the tone for the next 3 decades. They immediately arrest Harry Thuku on March 15, 1922. They hold him in the Nairobi police lines.
And word of his arrest spreads rapidly through the city. A spontaneous, massive strike erupts. Thousands of African workers walk off their jobs and gather outside the jail, demanding the release of their leader.
The atmosphere is incredibly tense. You have a massive crowd of unarmed Africans facing down armed colonial police. And then the inevitable happens.
The police panic. A shot is fired, and the police unleash a volley of gunfire directly into the unarmed crowd.
21 Africans are killed in the street.
The aftermath of the massacre is swift and absolute. Harry Thuku is deported to a remote area without a trial, and the East African Association is legally banned by the government.
This event profoundly altered the political calculus of the African population. It provided a stark, undeniable demonstration that the colonial state was perfectly willing to utilize lethal military force to crush peaceful constitutional protests.
It was a very clear message.
But the remarkable thing is that the African leadership does not simply give up. They regroup. In 1924, they formed the Kikuyu Central Association, or KCA.
And for the next 16 years, this organization tirelessly pushes the government for reform.
They demand legal title deeds for their remaining land, they demand access to higher education, and they demand actual elected political representation.
They even launch a vernacular newspaper called Withania, which translates to the Unifier.
And they use it to spread their political ideology and coordinate actions across different districts. They actively work to build alliances with other ethnic groups like the Kemba and the Tita.
They are doing exactly what a civilized political movement is supposed to do.
And how does the British government reward 16 years of political organizing? In 1940, using the outbreak of World War II as a convenient pretext regarding colonial security, the British banned the KCA entirely and arrested its top leadership.
It's just endless suppression. Following the end of World War II, as global empires are beginning to fracture, there is one final, desperate attempt at a peaceful political solution in Kenya.
The Kenya African Union, or KAU, established in 1944.
Right. The leadership of KAU observes the political shifts in Europe, particularly the rise of the Labour Party government in Britain. And they hope this will finally usher in an era of democratic reform for the colonies.
KAU's platform is comprehensive. They demand universal voting rights, the total abolition of the legally enforced color bar that dictates segregation, and a fundamental resolution to the land crisis.
They are actively trying to construct a national movement, speaking for all 6 million Kenyans.
And the energy behind KAU is massive. This isn't a fringe group. Simultaneously, you have a surge in radical trade unionism in the cities.
Yes. In May 1950, union leaders like Makan Singh and Fred Kubai organize a massive 18-day general strike in Nairobi that completely paralyzes the city's economy.
KAU leverages this momentum, building a paid membership of over 100,000 people. They are holding massive political rallies, drawing crowds of 30 to 50,000 people.
Energized by charismatic leaders like Jomo Kenyatta.
They are demonstrating overwhelming, undeniable popular support for reform.
But despite this massive mobilization, the white settler elite, who hold absolute sway over the colonial government apparatus, remain entirely intransigent.
They refuse to yield a single inch.
Not a single inch of political power or a single acre of the White Highlands. They view any concession as the beginning of the end of white supremacy in East Africa.
When you lay out this timeline, the transition to armed revolt makes perfect logical sense.
It's the only path left.
The British spent 3 decades systematically removing every single safety valve from the societal pressure cooker. Every time the African population formed a political association, drafted a formal petition, or organized a labor strike, the colonial state responded with bans, deportations, imprisonment, and bullets.
The government explicitly demonstrated that playing by the rules was a dead end.
When you make peaceful change legally and physically impossible, you guarantee that change will eventually take a violent form.
That is the crucial takeaway from Barnett and Njama's analysis. The Kikuyu naturally formed the vanguard of the coming violence because they existed at the exact intersection of all these pressures.
They were feeling the devastating squeeze of the land shortage more acutely than anyone else due to their proximity to the White Highlands.
Right. They possessed the most highly developed network of independent schools to disseminate political thought.
And they were deeply enmeshed in the radical urban union movement in Nairobi.
They had the motive, they had the intellectual framework, and they had the organizational networks.
Exactly. And without this extensive 30-year buildup of political ideology, the decades of drafted petitions, the vernacular newspapers, the independent school curriculums, the Mau Mau revolt would not have been a revolution.
It would merely have been a riot.
And a riot is a spontaneous, temporary explosion of accumulated anger. A revolution, however, requires a sustaining ideology. It requires a deeply articulated why.
As the authors of our source material note, it was this long, painful history of suppressed political education that provided the necessary ideological foundation.
It is what allowed a humble schoolteacher like Karari Njama to abandon his home, enter the freezing Aberdare forests, and endure years of starvation, disease, and constant military pursuit.
They were not fighting out of some atavistic, primitive savagery, as the propaganda claimed. They were fighting for clearly defined political objectives.
Land and freedom, ideals that had been meticulously articulated and refined over 3 decades of political struggle.
Exactly.
So, to synthesize this entire journey for you listening, the Mau Mau revolt was absolutely not the sudden, irrational bloodlust depicted in the 1950s newsreels.
It was the highly organized, inevitable boiling over of a brutally engineered system.
The colonial state systematically stole their land to force them into poverty, weaponized the tax system to force them into cheap labor, and utilized the Kipande system to monitor their every movement.
And when the Kikuyu pushed back culturally, building independent schools and churches, and politically forming unions and associations, the government slammed every door in their face with lethal force.
The revolt was the final, desperate response of a people who had exhausted every other option.
Understanding those mechanics is so vital. But the preface of Mau Mau from Within leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to consider, one that extends far beyond the 1950s.
Yeah, we have spent this entire deep dive analyzing the mechanics of physical decolonization, the fight to reclaim the land and dismantle the colonial government.
But the authors point to a much more insidious, lingering challenge, the decolonization of the mind.
This is the invisible tragedy of the colonial aftermath.
It is. The text points out that even decades after the revolt, long after Kenya had achieved independence, many young, highly educated African intellectuals still looked down upon the traditional symbols and the veterans of the forest fight.
Despite their education, they had deeply internalized the very colonial propaganda that their own ancestors had died fighting against.
They viewed the traditional ways and the raw, unpolished history of the forest fighters with a sense of embarrassment, preferring the sanitized, European-approved versions of modernity.
It forces you to ask a profound question about the nature of freedom. When a colonized nation finally wins its physical independence, when the treaties are signed and the colonizer's flag is lowered, the physical war is over.
But how many generations does it take to scrub the propaganda from the culture?
How long does it take for a nation to truly win back its own memory?
Dismantling an engineered system of physical control is incredibly difficult, as we've seen. But dismantling the psychological architecture of colonial shame is arguably the hardest battle of all.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Mau Mau from Within. The next time you find yourself reading an official historical narrative, I hope you remember the contrast of Karari Najama, the man in the tattered jacket and the man drinking tea overlooking the Gua River Valley.
Always ask yourself who is constructing the narrative and what mechanics of power they might be hiding.
Keep questioning the systems around you. We'll see you next time.